Ladies and gentlemen, Flight 437 from Detroit has now arrived at Gate C14.
Welcome. Today I will tell you a new scary story. Before the start, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so that the videos come out more often. And also let us know where you are watching this video and how much time you have. Enjoy your viewing. I've flown hundreds of times for work and I've learned to ignore the usual inconveniences. Crying babies, chatty seatmates, turbulence. None of it bothers me anymore. But what happened on Flight 437 from Denver to Atlanta still keeps me up at night. And I can't quite explain why. The flight was delayed 2 hours due to weather. By the time we boarded, everyone was irritable and exhausted. I had my usual aisle seat in row 23, and I was already half asleep before we even taxied to the runway. The plane was maybe 70% full, so most people had empty seats beside them. I didn't pay attention to anyone in particular until I noticed him. He was in 14C, a middle seat, even though there were dozens of empty rows. That struck me as odd, but people make strange choices. What really caught my attention was how still he sat. Everyone else was shifting around, adjusting pillows, scrolling through their phones during the delay. He just sat there, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead at the seat in front of him. I only noticed because I happened to look up the aisle while the flight attendants were doing their safety demonstration. His profile was visible from where I sat. Pale, clean-shaven, probably in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket despite the stuffy cabin air. There was something about his posture, the rigid way he held himself, that made me keep glancing back. About 30 minutes into the flight, after the seatbelt sign went off, I got up to use the bathroom. As I walked past row 14, I looked at him more closely. His eyes were open, unblinking, still fixed on that seat back. His hands hadn't moved. For a moment, I wondered if he was asleep with his eyes open. I'd heard that was possible. But then I saw his throat move as he swallowed, and I knew he was awake. When I came back from the bathroom, he had turned his head. He was looking at the woman across the aisle from him. 2 rows up. She was young, maybe mid-20s, wearing headphones and reading something on her tablet. She had no idea he was watching her. The way he stared wasn't overtly threatening. It was worse than that. It was patient, studious, like he was memorizing every detail. I told myself I was being paranoid. People zone out on planes. Maybe he was just spacing out in her general direction. I settled back into my seat and tried to sleep, but I kept thinking about those unmoving hands, that unwavering stare. An hour passed. I woke up from a light doze and instinctively looked toward row 14 again. He had moved to the aisle seat now, the empty aisle seat 14D, directly across from where he'd been sitting. I felt my stomach tighten. Why would someone move seats mid-flight on a half-empty plane just to sit one seat over? Then I understood. From 14D, he had a direct line of sight to the woman. She was in 12F, the window seat, and now he could watch her without turning his head. He sat there with that same rigid posture, hands folded, eyes locked on her. She still hadn't noticed. Her headphones were on, and she'd reclined her seat slightly, probably trying to sleep. I should have said something. I know that now, but what would I have said? "Excuse me, flight attendant. That man is sitting quietly in his seat and looking in someone's general direction." It sounds absurd. Nothing illegal was happening. Nothing I could point to is wrong. Just a feeling crawling up my spine like cold fingers. The flight attendant came by with the beverage cart. When she asked him what he wanted, he didn't respond. At first, she had to ask twice. Then, without looking at her, he said, "Water," in a voice so flat and toneless it barely sounded human. She handed him a cup, and he took it with those same folded hands, moving with an odd mechanical precision. He didn't drink it, just held it in his lap. I watched him for another 20 minutes. He never touched the water, never looked at his phone, never shifted position, just stared at that woman with an intensity that felt increasingly wrong. At one point, she got up to use the bathroom, and his head tracked her movement down the aisle like a camera on a tripod. When she came back and settled into her seat, his gaze followed her every move as she adjusted her pillow and closed her eyes. That's when I noticed his mouth moving just slightly, barely perceptible. His lips were forming words, but no sound came out. He was whispering something over and over, too quiet for anyone to hear. I felt my chest tighten. I looked around to see if anyone else had noticed, but the passengers near him were asleep or absorbed in their screens. The cabin lights were dimmed for the night portion of the flight, and in the shadows he looked even more wrong. A figure carved from wax, animated by something I didn't want to name. I made a decision. I got up and walked to the back galley where a flight attendant was preparing coffee. I tried to explain what I'd seen, stumbling over my words because it all sounded so flimsy when I said it out loud. There's a man. He's watching another passenger. He moved seats to watch her better. I think something might be wrong. The flight attendant, an older woman with kind eyes, listened patiently. Has he approached her or said anything to her? No, has he done anything threatening? Not exactly. She promised she'd keep an eye on the situation and thanked me for saying something. I could tell she thought I was overreacting, and maybe I was, but she did walk through the cabin a few minutes later, making a show of checking on passengers. When she passed row 14, I watched from my seat. The man didn't acknowledge her, didn't even glance up, just kept staring forward with those dead eyes, lips still moving in that silent whisper. The flight attendant looked at the woman he'd been watching. She was asleep now, head against the window. Nothing seemed immediately wrong, so the flight attendant continued on. The last hour of the flight was the worst. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop watching him. At some point, he pulled out his phone. The screen illuminated his face with a pale blue glow, and I saw him typing something, his thumbs moving rapidly. Then he held the phone up slightly, and I realized with a jolt of horror that he was angling it toward the sleeping woman, taking pictures, recording. I couldn't be sure from where I sat, but the way he held it, the careful angle, it seemed obvious. When the captain announced our descent into Atlanta, the man finally moved. He put his phone away, stood up, and retrieved a small black backpack from the overhead bin. Then he sat back down and returned to that same rigid posture, hands folded, waiting. The woman in 12F woke up and began gathering her things, completely unaware. We landed. The seatbelt sign went off. Everyone stood up in that typical rush to deplane, crowding the aisle with their luggage. I kept my eyes on the man. He didn't stand up immediately. He waited, watching as the woman grabbed her bag and started moving toward the front of the plane. Only then did he step into the aisle, timing it perfectly to end up about 3 people behind her in the line. I followed them both. I don't know why. Some instinct told me I needed to see this through. We shuffled off the plane, through the jetway, and into the terminal. The woman walked quickly, heading toward baggage claim. The man followed at a distance, keeping her in sight, but never closing the gap. His gait was strange, measured, purposeful, like someone executing a practiced routine. At baggage claim, I positioned myself where I could watch them both. The woman stood by carousel 3, checking her phone and yawning. The man stood about 15 ft away, partially obscured by a pillar, watching her. He was so focused on her that he didn't even look at the baggage carousel when bags started coming out. He only moved when she grabbed her suitcase, a distinctive red hardshell, and started walking toward the exit. He followed. No luggage of his own, just that black backpack. I followed too, my heart pounding. The woman walked through the automatic doors and joined the taxi line. The man stopped just inside the terminal, standing beside a concrete pillar, watching her through the glass. He pulled out his phone again. I approached him. I don't know what I was thinking, that I'd confront him, ask him what he was doing, make him aware he'd been noticed. But as I got closer, he suddenly turned and walked away, moving quickly into the crowd. Within seconds, he'd vanished into the flow of travelers, and I lost sight of him completely. I stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. Through the glass, I could see the woman getting into a taxi. She drove away, safe for now, completely unaware that anything unusual had happened. Maybe nothing had. Maybe I just witnessed an awkward man who happened to be on the same flight, who happened to look in someone's direction, who happened to walk through the same terminal. But I don't believe that. I've replayed those hours in my mind countless times, and every time I feel that same cold certainty. Something was wrong with that man. Cold certainty. Something was wrong with that man. The way he moved, the way he watched, the mechanical precision of it all. It felt rehearsed, practiced. I filed a report with airport security before I left. Gave them my contact information, described the man and what I'd seen. They took notes and thanked me. I never heard back. I've checked the news, searched for anything related to that flight or that date. Nothing. No incidents, no arrests, no reports of anything unusual on Flight 437. Sometimes I wonder if the woman ever knew she was being watched, if she ever felt that crawling sensation of being studied, memorized, followed, or if she just went home, unpacked her red suitcase, and forgot all about a routine flight from Denver to Atlanta. I still fly for work, but now I watch people more carefully, looking for those little signs that something is off. The too-still posture, the unwavering stare, the patient practiced precision of movement. And sometimes in crowded terminals or on late-night flights, I think I see him again. That same pale face, those same dead eyes watching someone new. but it's never him. At least I don't think it is. I was on a red-eye from Phoenix to Boston, one of those flights where everyone just wants to sleep and get it over with. I'd grabbed a window seat near the back, hoping the darkness and engine noise would knock me out for most of the 6-hour flight. The plane was about half full, scattered with business travelers and a few families heading home. The guy who sat down next to me seemed normal enough at first, mid-30s, wearing a button-down shirt and khakis, carrying a leather messenger bag. He nodded politely when he took the middle seat, stowed his bag under the seat in front of him, and buckled in. I went back to looking out the window, watching the ground crew load luggage. We took off just after 11 hour. The cabin lights dimmed and most people settled into sleep. I had my earbuds in listening to a podcast, trying to relax. That's when I noticed he'd pulled out a notebook, one of those composition books with the black and white marbled cover. He opened it to somewhere in the middle and started writing. Nothing weird about that. Lots of people journal on flights, but something about the way he wrote caught my attention. His hand moved frantically across the page, barely pausing, like he was transcribing something he was hearing rather than composing his own thoughts. And he never looked up, not once, just wrote and wrote and wrote in the dim overhead light. I tried to ignore it and focus on my podcast, but I kept glancing over. I couldn't help it. The sheer intensity of his writing was mesmerizing in an uncomfortable way. His hand cramped at one point and he flexed his fingers before immediately continuing as if stopping wasn't an option. Pages filled rapidly, his handwriting tiny and cramped. About an hour into the flight, he paused. He sat very still for a moment, staring down at what he'd written. Then he flipped back several pages and began reading, his lips moving silently as his eyes tracked across the lines. His expression shifted, a slight frown, then something that looked almost like confusion, as if he didn't recognize his own words. He turned his head slightly, looking past me toward the window. "What row are we in?" he asked suddenly. His voice startled me. I pulled out an earbud. What row is this?" "A 32. He nodded slowly and wrote 32 in the margin of his notebook, circling it multiple times. Then he went back to reading, his finger tracing along the lines of text. I noticed his fingernails were bitten down to the quick, the skin around them raw and irritated. I put my earbud back in, but I'd lost interest in the podcast. There was something off about the exchange, though I couldn't pinpoint what. Maybe it was the way he'd asked about the row number, not casually, but with an urgency that seemed disproportionate to the question. Another 30 minutes passed. He kept writing, filling page after page. At one point, the flight attendant came by offering water, and he didn't respond until she asked 3 times. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes seemed unfocused, like he was looking through her rather than at her. He declined the water and immediately returned to his notebook. I managed to doze off for a while. When I woke up, maybe an hour later, he was still writing. My neck was stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle, and I shifted in my seat trying to get comfortable. As I moved, I accidentally caught a glimpse of the page he was working on. What I saw made my stomach drop. The page was filled with seat numbers, rows, and letters written over and over in columns. 12A, 12B, 12C, 12D, 12E, 12F, 13A, 13B, and so on. The entire page was just seat designations methodically listed with occasional numbers written in the margins, times maybe, or something else. Between some of the seat numbers, he'd written single words: asleep, reading, child alone. He was cataloging the passengers. I felt a chill run through me. I looked away quickly, pretending I hadn't seen anything, but my mind was racing. Why would someone list every seat on a plane? What was the purpose of noting who was alone, who was asleep? I glanced around the dim cabin. Most people had their overhead lights off, heads resting against windows or slumped in their seats. A flight attendant sat in the jump seat near the galley looking at her phone. Everything appeared normal, peaceful even, but now it all felt different, tainted by what I'd seen in that notebook. The man beside me turned the page and started writing again. This time it looked like full sentences, but his handwriting was so small and cramped that I couldn't make out the words from my angle. He wrote for several more minutes, then stopped abruptly and closed the notebook. He sat there holding it closed with both hands, pressing down on the cover as if something might escape from between the pages. Then he stood up. "Excuse me," he muttered, and I pulled my legs back to let him pass. He walked toward the front of the plane, notebook clutched against his chest. I watched him go, telling myself it was fine. He was just going to the bathroom, but he didn't head for the lavatories. Instead, he paused at different rows, seeming to look at the passengers sleeping there. Not in an obvious way, He'd pretend to check the overhead bin or adjust his footing, but his eyes were always on the people in the seats. He made it to around row 15 before a flight attendant approached him. I couldn't hear their conversation, but she seemed to be asking if he needed help finding something. He shook his head and pointed back toward our row, indicating he was returning to his seat. But he took his time walking back, continuing to glance at passengers as he passed. When he sat down again, he opened the notebook and started writing immediately. I was wide awake now, every nerve on edge. I pulled out my phone and pretended to scroll through it, but I was really trying to figure out what to do. Should I tell a flight attendant? Tell them what exactly? That my seatmate was writing things down. That wasn't a crime. I noticed his leg was bouncing now, a rapid, nervous tremor. He wrote faster, the pen pressing hard into the paper. At one point, he paused and stared at what he'd written, then violently scribbled over an entire paragraph, scratching it out so aggressively that he tore through the page. He made a small, frustrated sound and flipped to a new page, starting again. The flight attendants came through with trash collection. When they reached our row, the man quickly closed his notebook and held it against his chest again, like he was protecting it. The flight attendant asked if he had any trash. He shook his head without making eye contact. As soon as she moved on, he opened the notebook again and resumed writing. We were maybe 2 hours from Boston when something changed. He stopped writing and just sat there staring at the seat back in front of him. His expression was blank, but there was a tension in his jaw, a tightness around his eyes. He reached up and adjusted the air vent even though it wasn't on. Then he adjusted it again and again, a small repetitive gesture that he seemed unable to stop. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. I don't know why I said it. Maybe because the silence felt unbearable. He turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw his eyes clearly. They were bloodshot and wet, like he'd been crying or hadn't slept in days. "Do you ever feel like you've forgotten something important?" he asked. "Something you absolutely need to remember, but it's just gone." I didn't know how to respond. "Sometimes, I guess." He nodded and looked down at his notebook. "I write things down so I don't forget. Every flight, every detail. Because if I don't," he trailed off, his fingers tightening on the notebook's cover. "If I don't, something bad might happen." The way he said it, so matter-of-fact, so certain, made my skin crawl. "What kind of something?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. He didn't answer, just opened the notebook again and started writing. But now I could see his hand was shaking. The rest of the flight felt endless. He filled at least 10 more pages before we began our descent into Boston. When the captain announced we'd be landing soon, he carefully closed the notebook and put it back in his messenger bag. Then he sat perfectly still, hands folded in his lap, staring straight ahead. We landed without incident. The plane taxied to the gate and everyone stood up to collect their belongings. I grabbed my bag from the overhead bin, eager to get off and put distance between myself and this strange, unsettling man. But as we shuffled toward the exit, I noticed him one more time. He was standing in the aisle, but he wasn't moving forward with everyone else. He was looking back at the seats we just left, his eyes scanning the rows, his lips moving as if counting. A woman behind him said, "Excuse me," impatiently, and he snapped out of it, turning to follow the line. I didn't see him in the terminal. I collected my luggage and caught a taxi, relieved to be away from the plane and whatever strange compulsion had gripped my seatmate. But that night, lying in my hotel room, I couldn't stop thinking about that notebook, about the lists and the seat numbers and the desperate way he'd clutched it, about his question. "Do you ever feel like you've forgotten something important?" And I wondered, what was he so afraid of forgetting? What did he think would happen if he stopped writing, stopped documenting every flight, every passenger, every detail? I've flown dozens of times since then, and I always find myself watching other passengers more carefully now, looking for the telltale signs, the frantic writing, the scanning eyes, the desperate cataloging of details. Once on a flight to Denver, I saw someone with a similar notebook, writing with that same intensity. I didn't ask questions that time. I just moved seats at the first opportunity. Sometimes I still wonder if I sat next to him again on some flight, and if that's why he was writing everything down so he'd remember me, if we ever crossed paths once more. The flight from Seattle to Miami was packed. Spring break season, so the plane was full of college students, families with kids, and the usual mix of business travelers trying to tune everyone out. I was in 18BB, the dreaded middle seat, wedged between a teenager glued to his phone and an older woman by the window, who'd already kicked off her shoes and settled in for the flight. The boarding process took forever. People struggled with oversized carry-ons. Families got separated and tried to swap seats. The usual chaos. I wasn't paying much attention until she sat down in 17B directly in front of me. She was probably in her late 20s, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweatshirt. Nothing about her appearance was unusual. What caught my attention was her smile. She was smiling as she sat down. Not at anyone in particular, not at something on her phone, just smiling at nothing. This wide, fixed smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I've seen plenty of people smile to themselves on planes. Someone remembering something funny or maybe just in a good mood. But there was something about this smile that felt wrong. It was too consistent, too perfect, like a mask that had been painted on. The plane pushed back from the gate and the flight attendants began their safety demonstration. The woman in 17B kept smiling, facing forward, hands folded neatly on the armrests. When the flight attendant walked past to check seatbelts, she smiled at her too. That same unwavering smile. The flight attendant smiled back politely but quickly looked away, and I noticed a slight furrow in her brow, like something had bothered her. We took off and the seatbelt sign turned off after about 20 minutes. Most people immediately pulled out phones, books, or went to sleep. I tried to read on my tablet, but I kept noticing the woman in front of me. She hadn't moved since sitting down. Same posture, same position, and from the angle where I sat I could see the edge of her face still smiling. The guy next to me eventually fell asleep, his head lolling against the window. The woman on my other side put in earbuds and closed her eyes. The cabin settled into that quiet hum of a long flight. I finally managed to focus on my book for a while, getting through a few chapters. Then I heard it. A soft sound, barely audible over the engine noise. At first I thought it was the air conditioning or something mechanical. But as I listened more carefully, I realized it was coming from the woman in 17B. She was humming the same 3 or 4 notes over and over again in a loop. Pleasant notes, almost like a lullaby, but the repetition made it grating. I tried to ignore it, but once I'd noticed, I couldn't unhear it. The same short melody, never varying, never stopping. Just that endless loop of notes accompanied by her continued smiling at nothing. A little girl, maybe 5 years old, walked past our row, heading to the bathroom with her mother. The woman in 17B turned her head to watch them pass. That smile never wavered, but she tracked the little girl's movement with an intensity that seemed inappropriate. The child noticed and moved closer to her mother, suddenly shy. When they came back from the bathroom a few minutes later, the woman in 17B was still turned around in her seat, waiting. As the little girl passed, the woman reached out and touched the child's arm. Just a light touch, nothing aggressive, but the little girl jumped and the mother pulled her away quickly, giving the woman a sharp look. The woman just smiled wider and turned back around, resuming her forward-facing position. The humming continued. I noticed the teenage boy next to me had woken up and was scrolling through his phone. At one point, he held it up to take a selfie. I saw the woman in 17B's head turn slightly, and in the reflection of his phone screen, I caught a glimpse of her face. She was looking at him through the gap between the seats. That smile still frozen in place, eyes fixed and unblinking. The kid must have seen her too, because he quickly lowered his phone and shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He put his earbuds in and turned toward the window, deliberately facing away from the gap. The flight attendants came through with the beverage service. When they reached row 17, I watched as they asked the woman what she wanted to drink. She didn't respond immediately, just kept smiling. The flight attendant asked again, a bit louder. The woman slowly turned her head to look at the flight attendant, that smile still in place, and said, "Orange juice," in a voice that was almost mechanical in its flatness. The contrast between the big smile and the dead tone was jarring. She accepted the cup of orange juice, placed it on her tray table, and never touched it. Just let it sit there while she returned to her forward-facing position, smiling, humming that same repetitive tune. I was starting to feel genuinely uncomfortable. There was something deeply wrong about the whole situation, but I couldn't articulate what it was. She wasn't doing anything threatening, wasn't breaking any rules. She was just off like a person-shaped thing that hadn't quite figured out how to act human convincingly. About 2 hours into the flight, a man from a few rows back walked past to use the bathroom. As he returned to his seat, the woman in 17B suddenly stood up and stepped into the aisle, blocking his path. She just stood there smiling at him, not moving, not saying anything. The man looked confused and uncomfortable. "Excuse me," he said politely. She didn't move, didn't stop smiling. "I need to get past," he said, his voice firmer now. She tilted her head slightly like a curious dog, but still didn't move. The man looked around, clearly unsure what to do. A flight attendant noticed the situation and came over quickly. "Ma'am, you need to return to your seat," the flight attendant said with professional courtesy. But I could hear the edge in her voice. The woman slowly turned to look at the flight attendant, that relentless smile still fixed on her face. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, without a word, she sat back down. The man hurried past, looking rattled, and the flight attendant lingered for a moment, watching the woman with obvious concern before continuing to the back of the plane. The humming resumed immediately. Hum. I saw the flight attendant talking quietly with another crew member near the galley. They both glanced toward row 17, clearly discussing the woman. One of them picked up the phone to call the cockpit, but after a brief conversation, they hung up and returned to their duties. What could they report? A passenger who smiles too much and hums. The woman remained motionless for another hour, maintaining that same rigid posture. Then, without warning, she pulled out her phone. She held it up and appeared to take a photo of the seat in front of her. Then another and another, click, click, click. She took at least 20 photos of the back of the seat, the same angle every time. Then she turned the phone around and held it at arm's length, taking selfies. But here's what made my skin crawl. She took them with her eyes closed. Every single one. Eyes closed, smile still plastered across her face, snapping photo after photo. She must have taken 50 selfies, all with her eyes closed. The teenage boy next to me whispered, "What the hell is wrong with that lady?" I shook my head. I had no answer. She put her phone away and went back to her statue-like stillness, hands on armrests facing forward, smiling. The humming continued, that same short melody looping endlessly. I caught myself counting the repetitions at one point and had to stop because it was driving me crazy. As we began our descent into Miami, the captain announced we'd be landing in about 20 minutes. The woman in 17B reached up and pressed the call button. A flight attendant came over. "Yes, how can I help you?" The woman turned to look at her, and I saw her smile grow even wider, stretching her face in a way that looked painful. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said in that same flat, emotionless voice. "You've all been so wonderful." The flight attendant seemed unsettled by the disconnect between the words, the smile, and the tone. "You're welcome. Please make sure your seatbelt is fastened for landing." The woman nodded but didn't check her seatbelt, just returned to staring forward, smiling. We landed smoothly. The plane taxied to the gate and everyone stood up immediately, crowding the aisle with their luggage. I was eager to get off to put distance between myself and whatever was wrong with the woman in 17B. But as I stood up to grab my bag, I noticed she hadn't moved. While everyone else jostled for position, she remained seated, hands on armrests, still smiling. People filed past her. She didn't acknowledge anyone, didn't try to get her belongings, didn't stand up, just sat there with that frozen smile as the plane slowly emptied around her. I grabbed my bag and joined the line, glancing back at her one more time. She had turned her head and was looking directly at me. Our eyes met, and for just a second I saw something flicker in her expression. The smile faltered just barely, just for an instant, and what I saw underneath made my breath catch. It wasn't malice or anger or confusion. It was fear. Raw, desperate fear, like someone trapped somewhere they couldn't escape from. Then the smile snapped back into place and she turned forward again. I got off the plane as quickly as I could. At baggage claim, I kept scanning the crowd, half expecting to see her standing somewhere with that same smile, watching. But I never saw her again. Later, I found myself wondering if she ever got off that plane at all. If the crew had to deal with someone who simply refused to leave, or if she just kept sitting there smiling and humming, trapped in whatever hell existed behind that frozen expression. Sometimes when I'm on flights now, I catch myself looking at other passengers' faces, searching for that particular quality. The smile that doesn't match the eyes, the expression that seems painted on rather than genuine. And once in a while I see it, that disconnect, that wrongness, and I wonder if they're stuck too, just like she was smiling because they don't know how to stop. I take the same flight every other week for work, Chicago to Portland. Usually the 6 a.m. departure that gets me there by mid-morning. I know the routine by heart. Grab coffee at the gate, board in group 3, settle into my aisle seat, and catch up on emails during the flight. It's mundane and predictable, which is exactly how I like it. But 3 weeks ago, that routine was broken by the man in 22A. I was in 22C, my usual seat when I can get it. The middle seat, 22B, was empty, a small mercy on a full flight. The window seat was occupied before I even boarded. I noticed him immediately as I approached the row because of how he was sitting. His face was pressed against the window, forehead touching the glass, looking down at the tarmac below. His breath fogged the window in rhythmic circles. "Excuse me," I said, gesturing to my seat. He didn't move or acknowledge me. I said it again, louder. Nothing. I could see the side of his face, pale skin, dark circles under his eyes, lips moving slightly. A flight attendant noticed my hesitation and came over. "Sir," she said firmly, addressing the man in the window seat, "this passenger needs to get to their seat." He finally pulled his face away from the window and looked at us. His eyes were watery and unfocused, like he'd just woken up, though the plane hadn't even taken off yet. He stood without a word and stepped into the aisle, letting me slide past. As I moved by him, I caught a whiff of something stale and sour, like old sweat and unwashed clothes. He sat back down and immediately pressed his face against the window again, resuming that same position. The flight attendant gave me a quick, sympathetic look before moving on to help other passengers. I tried to ignore him and focus on my phone, checking messages and reviewing my calendar for the day. The plane pushed back from the gate and the safety demonstration began. I glanced over at the man. He hadn't moved. His breath continued to fog the window in steady intervals, and I could hear a faint sound coming from him, a whisper barely audible. I couldn't make out words, just the soft sussation of continuous speech. We took off and the whisper continued. It wasn't loud enough to be disruptive, but once I noticed it, I couldn't tune it out. The same barely there murmur, never stopping, never varying in volume or intensity. Just an endless stream of whispered words pressed against the window glass. The seatbelt sign turned off and I pulled out my laptop to get some work done. But I found myself distracted, stealing glances at the man beside me. His position hadn't changed, face against window, lips moving, that constant whisper. His hands were clenched in his lap, knuckles white from the tension. About 30 minutes into the flight, a woman across the aisle leaned over and caught my attention. "Is he okay?" she moaned, gesturing toward the man. I shrugged helplessly. What was I supposed to say? He seemed physically fine. Just strange. The flight attendants came through with beverages. When they reached our row, they asked the man what he wanted. No response. They asked again. Nothing. One of them leaned in closer, trying to make eye contact. "Sir, would you like something to drink?" He slowly turned his head away from the window. His eyes didn't quite focus on the flight attendant, instead seeming to look through her. "Water," he whispered. The word barely audible, then immediately turned back to the window and resumed his whispered monologue. The flight attendant set a cup of water on his tray table. He never touched it. It sat there untouched until we landed. I managed to get about an hour of work done trying to focus on a presentation I needed to finalize. But then something changed. The whispering got slightly louder. Not by much, but enough that I could almost make out individual words. I found myself leaning slightly toward him, straining to hear, though part of me didn't want to know what he was saying. 27, 28, 29, 30, he whispered, his breath fogging the window. 1, 2, 3, 4. He was counting over and over, starting at 1 and going to 30, then starting again. The counting was interspersed with other words I couldn't quite catch, but the numbers were clear. 1 through 30. Endless repetition whispered against the cold glass. I tried to return my attention to my laptop, but the counting wormed its way into my head. I found myself anticipating each number, waiting for him to reach 30 so he could start over. It became hypnotic in the most unsettling way. Then he stopped. The sudden silence was jarring. I looked over at him. He'd pulled his face back from the window and was sitting normally, hands still clenched in his lap, staring at the seat in front of him. His jaw was tight, and I could see a muscle twitching in his cheek. For a few minutes, there was nothing, just normal airplane sounds. The engine hum, distant conversations, a baby crying a few rows back. I started to relax, thinking maybe whatever had been bothering him had passed. Then he turned to look at me. His eyes were completely bloodshot, the whites more red than white. He stared at me with an intensity that made my stomach drop. I opened my mouth to say something. I don't know what, but before I could speak, he leaned toward me. "Do you hear them too?" he whispered. His voice, "Hear what?" I managed to ask. "The engines. Listen to the engines." He leaned even closer, and I instinctively pressed back into my seat. "They're not right. The rhythm is wrong." "Can't you hear it?" I listened. The engine sounded normal to me. The same steady drone they always produced. "They sound fine," I said carefully. He shook his head violently. No. Listen. His voice rose slightly, and the woman across the aisle looked over with alarm. "The left engine is off by 3 seconds. It's going to fail. We need to land." "Why aren't we landing?" "The engines are fine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "We are perfectly safe. You don't understand," he hissed, grabbing my forearm. His grip was surprisingly strong, fingers digging into my skin. I've been counting since we took off. The vibrations, the oscillations, they're wrong. We need to tell the pilot." "We need to, sir." "They're wrong. We need to tell the pilot." "We need to, sir." A flight attendant appeared beside us, her voice firm but professional. "I need you to let go of this passenger and return to your own space." He released my arm immediately and turned back to the window, pressing his face against it once more. The whispering resumed, but now I could hear fear in it. Raw, desperate fear. The counting started again, faster this time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. The flight attendant leaned down to speak quietly to me. "Are you all right?"
"I'm fine," I said, rubbing my forearm where he'd grabbed me.
"But I think maybe he needs help," she nodded. "We're monitoring the situation. If he becomes more disruptive, we'll handle it. For now, try to stay calm and let us know if you need anything." She moved away, but I saw her whisper something to another crew member, and they both looked toward our row with concern. The man's counting grew faster and faster, the numbers tumbling over each other in a frantic whisper. "Onet Wu, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then he stopped abruptly and let out a small choked sound, something between a sob and a gasp. "It's happening," he whispered. "It's happening now." My heart started racing despite myself. I told myself he was delusional, probably having some kind of mental health episode. But something about his certainty made my anxiety spike. I found myself listening intently to the engines, trying to detect any irregularity. Nothing changed. The plane continued its steady flight, engines humming normally. The man began rocking slightly, still pressed against the window. 30 seconds, he whispered. 28, 27, he was counting down now. I gripped my armrests, hating myself for being affected by his fear, but unable to stop the tension building in my chest. 10, 9, 8, 7. Other passengers had noticed something was wrong. I could feel people watching our row. The cabin's mood shifting from bored indifference to alert unease. 321, nothing happened. The man let out a long, shuddering breath. Then he started laughing. A quiet, breathy sound that was somehow worse than the whispering. "Wrong equation," he muttered. "Wrong variables. Need to recalculate. Need to start over." And he did. The counting began again. 1, 2, 3, 4. The rest of the flight was a special kind of hell. The man counted continuously, occasionally stopping to recalculate and count down, only to resume counting when nothing happened. Each time he reached one, I felt my muscles tense involuntarily, waiting for something terrible that never came. We began our descent into Portland. The captain announced our arrival, and people started gathering their belongings. The man finally pulled away from the window and sat back in his seat, hands still clenched, staring straight ahead. "We made it," he said quietly, almost to himself. "We actually made it." I wasn't sure if he sounded relieved or disappointed. We landed safely, and everyone began deplaning. I stood up quickly, eager to get away. The man remained seated, making no move to leave. As I grabbed my bag from the overhead compartment, I glanced down at him one last time. He was looking up at me with those bloodshot eyes. "You were on a safe flight today," he said softly. "But I'll be on the next one too. And the one after that." And eventually he trailed off, turning back to look out the window at the terminal. Eventually the math will be right. I got off that plane as fast as I could. I've taken 3 flights since then, and every time I board, I scan the passengers nervously, looking for that pale face, those desperate eyes. Last week on a flight to Denver, I saw someone pressed against a window, lips moving in a silent count. My heart stopped until I got close enough to see it was a different person. Younger female, but with that same desperate intensity. She was counting too. I could see her lips forming the numbers. I took a different seat as far away as possible. but I couldn't stop thinking about what the man had said. That eventually the math would be right. And I wonder now, as I sit in airports and look at the other passengers waiting to board, how many of them are counting too? How many are running calculations, measuring oscillations, waiting for the moment when the numbers finally align? And what happens when they do? I was flying from Dallas to Newark for a cousin's wedding. A last-minute trip I'd almost skipped. The flight was on a Friday evening, packed with business travelers heading home for the weekend and families starting their vacations. I'd managed to snag an aisle seat in row 19, which felt like a small victory given how full the plane was. The woman who sat down in 19BB, the middle seat, arrived late in the boarding process. She was probably in her 40s, wearing a business suit and carrying an expensive-looking leather briefcase. She smiled apologetically as she squeezed past me, settling into her seat with the efficient movements of someone who flew frequently. "Sorry," she said pleasantly, cutting it close today. "No problem," I replied, already returning my attention to my phone. The flight took off without incident. I'd planned to sleep through most of it. I'd been up since 5 that morning, but as soon as we reached cruising altitude, the woman beside me opened her briefcase and pulled out a manila folder. Nothing unusual about that. Plenty of people work on flights. What made me notice was the way she looked at the contents. Her pleasant expression vanished, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. Not fear exactly, more like intense concentration mixed with resignation. She stared at the papers for a long moment before closing the folder and placing it face down on her lap. Then she turned to me. "I'm going to ask you something and I need you to take me seriously." I pulled out my earbuds, caught off guard by her directness, "Okay? If something happens to me on this flight, if I get sick or pass out or anything like that, I need you to take this folder." She tapped the manila folder on her lap. "Don't open it. Don't look inside. Just take it with you when you get off the plane and mail it to the address written on the back." "Can you do that?" I stared at her, completely thrown. What are you feeling?" "All right. I'm fine right now," she said, her voice calm but urgent. "But I need to know someone will do this if something goes wrong. It's important. Please." There was something in her eyes, a desperate sincerity that made it hard to dismiss this as a joke or some kind of scam. "Why don't you just mail it yourself when we land? Because I might not be able to." She glanced around the cabin, then leaned closer, lowering her voice. "I'm supposed to deliver this in person, but if I can't, if something prevents me from getting off this plane, someone needs to make sure it gets where it's going."
What's in it?
"It's better if you don't know," she said. "Safer." That word safer sent a chill through me. "Look, I don't know what you're involved in, but I don't want any part of I'm not involved in anything illegal." She interrupted. "I'm an accountant. This is just information numbers. But there are people who don't want this information going where it needs to go." She pressed the folder into my hands. "Please, just promise me if something happens to me, you'll mail this." I should have called a flight attendant right then. Should have refused to get involved. But there was something about the way she looked at me like I was her last hope that made me nod reluctantly. "Fine, but nothing's going to happen to you." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I hope you're right." She took the folder back and returned it to her briefcase, which she then carefully stowed under the seat in front of her. For the next 30 minutes, she sat very still, hands folded in her lap, staring at the seat back. I tried to read on my tablet, but I couldn't focus. The whole interaction had left me unsettled. I found myself glancing at her periodically, looking for signs of illness or distress. She seemed fine, perfectly healthy, just waiting. A flight attendant came by offering drinks. The woman ordered water and tomato juice. Strange combination, but whatever. She drank the water immediately in long, steady gulps like she was parched. The tomato juice she just held, not drinking it, staring down into the red liquid. "Are you sure you're okay?" I asked quietly. She nodded without looking at me. "How much longer until we land?" I checked my phone. "About 1 to 2 hours. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Okay, the plane hit some turbulence. Nothing severe, just enough to make the seatbelt sign ding on. The woman's hands tightened on her armrests, knuckles going white. I noticed she was shaking slightly. "Hey, it's just turbulence," I said, trying to be reassuring. "It'll pass in a minute." "It's not the turbulence," she whispered. Then she turned to look at me and I saw real fear in her eyes. "Someone on this plane knows what I'm carrying." I saw him when I boarded. He was standing near the gate pretending to look at his phone, but he was watching me. My stomach dropped. "Have you informed security?" "Say what, the flight crew? That I was observed by someone?" She gave a head shake. I don't have any evidence. All I know is that he was present. And now he's someplace on this plane. Suddenly suspicious, I scanned the cabin. Business travelers using computers to type. Families with children. An old couple reading a magazine together. Everybody appeared normal. Which one is he? I'm not sure. In the boarding queue, I lost sight of him. She spoke even more softly. However, he is aware of my seat. He would have noticed my seat assignment and watched me board. I said, "Okay, you're scaring me. We must notify someone if you truly believe you are in danger." The pilots and flight attendants make a scene and compel an emergency landing. She firmly shook her head. They most likely want that in order to keep me from getting to Newark. They will win if I cause a commotion and this flight is rerouted. Who are they? She remained silent. Just picked up the tomato juice and, with a tiny tremble in her fingers, took a sip. The cabin returned to the peaceful hum of flight as the turbulence subsided. I made an effort to persuade myself that the woman was paranoid, perhaps as a result of stress or anxiety, but I couldn't get rid of the uneasy feeling. After about 45 minutes, she suddenly got to her feet. She added, "I have to go to the bathroom." And there she squeezed past me into the aisle, leaving her briefcase under the seat, and I watched her move quickly toward the back of the plane. She looked over her shoulder once, and I followed her gaze, and I saw a man in a dark jacket standing up several rows behind us, heading in the same direction. My heart raced, wondering if he was following her or if I was just getting paranoid now. 5 minutes went by, then 10. Didn't return. I continued to watch the aisle, waiting for her to return. After 15 minutes, I became very concerned. I pressed the call button and a flight attendant arrived. "The woman who was sitting here," I said, pointing to the empty middle seat. The man in the dark jacket had returned to his seat. The flight attendant nodded professionally and said, "She's been in the bathroom for a while. I'm a little concerned. I'll see how she's doing," I observed as she made her way to the rear and knocked on a bathroom door. No answer. She tried the handle after knocking once more. The door parted. It wasn't secured. With a perplexed expression, the flight attendant glanced inside before turning back to face the front of the aircraft. She came back to me. "None of the restrooms are occupied." "Are you certain she used the restroom?" I saw her make her way back there." The flight attendant suggested that she might have gone to the front labs instead, but she was unsure. The lady in seat 19B was asked to return to her seat after they made an announcement. No answer. As other passengers began to realize something wasn't right, I could sense the tension rising in the cabin. The entire aircraft was searched by the flight attendants. Every restroom, every row, including the storage spaces and galleys, was examined. There was no sign of the woman on the aircraft. However, that was not feasible. She couldn't have simply disappeared. At 30,000 feet, there was nowhere to fly. A flight attendant and what appeared to be the head purser returned to me. "Did you notice anyone else come up to this row, sir? Did the traveler talk to anyone?" "No, she simply stood up and went to the restroom. That's all." They questioned me further about our talk, her appearance, and whether or not she had mentioned feeling sick. With the exception of the folder, I told them everything. I refrained from doing that for some reason. After a while, they resumed their work, conversing in hurried, low voices. I overheard one of them indicate they would get in touch with the captain, possibly local law enforcement. Now I sat by myself in the row, gazing at the vacant middle seat. The seat in front of it still had her briefcase beneath it. Probably thinking it was mine, the flight attendants hadn't spotted it. Her words kept repeating in my mind, even though a part of me wanted to open it to see if the folder was still there. Avoid opening it. Avoid looking inside. 30 minutes later, we arrived in Newark. At the gate, police were waiting. They asked me a lot of questions about the woman's appearance, our conversations, and the last time I saw her. Again, I didn't bring up the folder, but I did tell them the majority of it. They conducted a comprehensive search of the aircraft. Every compartment, every area big enough to conceal an individual. There was no sign of her. One of the officers informed me in private that he had never witnessed something like this in his 20 years. It's not common for somebody to simply vanish off aircraft, but she had. They eventually released me. I gathered my baggage and headed to the cab stand. I had taken the briefcase from under the seat, but nobody had spotted me in the confusion of the interrogation and search. Right now it was in my carry-on bag. I opened it with trembling hands at my hotel that evening. As she had mentioned, the manila folder was inside. There was a New York City address on the back. Just an address, no name, For the past 3 days, I have been gazing at this folder. I haven't mailed it, but I haven't opened it either because I can't stop thinking about what she said to me just before she vanished. It's preferable if you are unaware. Safer. And I wonder if she was racing in the direction of or away from something. Was she made to vanish by someone on that plane? Or did she plan her own disappearance? Was she attempting to keep this knowledge private? Or had she always been the danger? The folder's address is just 20 minutes away from here. I could personally deliver it and learn more about this. Alternatively, I may send it and distance myself from the entire situation. Alternatively, I may trash it and act as if nothing had ever happened. However, all options suddenly seem risky, since if individuals were willing to make a woman vanish in flight from a plane, what would they do to someone who knew she had given them something beforehand? I still haven't made up my mind about what to do with the folder that is sitting on my motel desk. However, I can't stop thinking about anything else she mentioned. Something I didn't tell the police. I'm carrying something that someone on this plane is aware of, and now I see that she was correct. They made sure she never got off the plane in some way, so someone did know. They may also be aware that I now possess it. I was fortunate to have a seat at all on the oversold aircraft from Boston to San Francisco. That day I had been on standby for 3 flights, anxiously waiting by the gate while I watched families and business travelers board. When my name was finally called for the 8 p.m. departure, I was so happy to be returning home that I virtually raced down the jetway. Naturally, I was seated in the middle, deep in the rear, next to the engines, on seat 31B. A man in his 30s with sandy hair, trousers, and a gray hoodie already taken the window seat. As I got closer, he looked up, nodded courteously, and went back to staring out the window. After putting my luggage away, I crammed myself into the middle seat. Even when the last boarding announcements were made, the aisle seat was still unoccupied. A tiny miracle. Just as I was getting comfortable and thinking I might be able to relax a little, a flight attendant and a woman who appeared to be in a hurry showed up. The flight attendant remarked, "This is 31C," pointing to the vacant aisle seat. The woman sighed in exhaustion and took a heavy seat. Wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, she was likely in her late 20s. Her blonde hair was tied back into an untidy bun. Her eyes were puffy and red, and her makeup was smudged as if she had been crying. She glanced past me to the man sitting in the window seat as soon as she sat down. Her face turned white. "Oh my God," she muttered. The man turned to face her. They simply gazed at one another for a considerable amount of time. Then he grinned. Something colder than a welcoming smile. "What are you doing here, small world?" he said. "Same as you going to San Francisco," she said in a barely audible voice that had a hint of terror. The plane pushed back from the gate, and during the safety demonstration, I noticed the woman was not paying attention at all. His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it that made me uncomfortable. The woman appeared to be sick, fumbled for her phone with trembling hands, then seemed to remember we were about to take off and put it away. She pressed herself against the armrest as far away from him as she could get, even though I was between them. I felt very awkward, caught in the middle of what was obviously a tense situation. When we took off and the seatbelt sign was turned off, the woman pressed her call button and a flight attendant came over. "Is there any way I can change seats?" she asked in a strained voice. "Please, I really need to move." The flight attendant glanced around the crowded cabin and apologized. The woman repeated more urgently, "Please, you don't understand. I can't sit here. I can't. Is there a problem?" The flight attendant asked in a more serious tone, and the man in the window seat leaned forward slightly, glancing past me at her. "There's no problem," he said smoothly. "We're completely full tonight. Every seat is taken." "We're completely full tonight. Every seat is taken." The flight attendant looked between them, obviously trying to gauge the situation. "Sir, ma'am, I need both of you to remain calm. If there's any disturbance, we'll have to take further action, but right now, if you can both just stay in your seats and keep to yourself." For the woman appeared to want to argue, but she simply nodded silently and turned away, pressing herself against the far armrest. After the flight attendant departed, I sat there in uncomfortable silence, feeling the tension emanating from both sides. I tried to concentrate on the movie playing on my seatback screen, but I couldn't. About 20 minutes into the flight, the man spoke again, his voice low enough that only we could hear over the engine noise. "You blocked my number." The woman didn't answer or look at him. "I have nothing to say to you. It's been 3 months. Don't you think we should talk?" she remarked in a tense voice. He reclined in his chair and continued to gaze out the window, saying, "But I have things to say to you." He said, "I want you to know that I forgive you for the things you said. For calling the well, for overreacting. I know you were emotional. I've been thinking about our last conversation a lot. About what you said, about what you accused me of. I desperately wished I was sitting somewhere else, anywhere else." The woman's hands were clenched in her lap, her knuckles white, and she said, "Stop talking to me, but we're seatmates now. Fate brought us together." There was a barely contained excitement in his voice that made my skin crawl. "Don't you think that means something? That after everything, we end up on the same flight in the same row? Out of all the flights, all the seats, it doesn't mean anything," she said. But I could hear the fear in her voice. He turned to look at her now, leaning forward so he could see her past me. I tried to shrink back in my seat, thinking, what are the odds, really? You moved to San Francisco 2 months ago, changed your number, cut off all our mutual friends, and here we are. She wouldn't look at him. "I don't want to talk to you. Just leave me alone." The woman froze when he said, "How do you? I'm very good at finding information. You should know that about me by now, and San Francisco isn't that big. Not really." She reached for her call button again, but he spoke more quickly, saying, "You should also know that I've been very patient. 3 months is a long time to wait, to plan, but I wanted to give you time to settle down, realize that you overreacted and miss me." "I'm calling the flight attendant and telling them what? That I'm talking to you, that we're having a conversation," she said, her voice trembling. "They'll think you're being dramatic, which they already do. You asked to change seats, remember? You're the one making a scene. I should have said something, should have called for help myself, but I was frozen between them." A flight attendant passed by and the woman half stood to get her attention, saying, "Excuse me, I need." However, the flight attendant was attending to another passenger and didn't notice her, so the woman sat back down looking defeated. The man grinned and said, "See, it's just you and me. Well, and our friend here." He nodded toward me and I felt his eyes on me for the first time. "You don't mind, do you? That we're talking, old friends catching up?" He turned back to the woman and said, "So tell me about San Francisco. Do you like your job? The coffee shop on the corner of your street must be nice. You go there every morning at 7:30, don't you?" I didn't know what to say. If I agreed, I was taking his side. If I disagreed, I might become part of whatever this was. I just wanted a quiet flight. I managed. "Of course, we'll keep it down. You're watching me. You've been watching me. I prefer to think of it as staying informed about your well-being. I worry about you. Living in a new city alone. Anything could happen. You could have an accident on your way to work. The world is so dangerous. I love that you're still such a creature of habit." She was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. I finally found my voice and said, "I'm going to call the flight attendant." His expression hardened as he turned to face me, saying, "I wouldn't do that if I were you. This is a private conversation between me and her. You should probably just put your headphones in and mind your own business." There was a coldness in his eyes that gave me the impression that he was capable of more than just words. I thought about the woman's red eyes, her obvious fear, her desperation to switch seats, and the fact that he knew her address, her schedule, and that he was following her across the nation. I pressed my call button, and the same flight attendant appeared. I pointed to the woman and said, "Yes, this man is harassing her." He calmly responded, "They're not threats. I'm simply telling her about San Francisco. I didn't threaten anyone." "Did I threaten you, ma'am?" the flight attendant inquired, glancing at the woman who was still crying and staring down at her lap. "Did he threaten you?" The woman's lips moved, but at first there was no sound, and then there was just a murmur. The flight attendant's face changed. "He knows where I live. Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to stop communicating with this passenger." "Of course," he said with approval. The flight attendant looked at the woman and said, "I apologize if I made anyone uncomfortable. I'll just enjoy the rest of my flight quietly. If he speaks to you again, press your call button immediately. We're taking this seriously." After she left, silence fell over our row, but it wasn't a comfortable silence. Rather, it was thick with tension and unspoken threats. The woman sat rigidly in her seat, barely breathing, and the man returned to staring out the window with that faint smile on his face. The flight was unbearable. 3 more hours of sitting between them, feeling the weight of whatever history they shared, whatever he had planned. Every time he moved in his seat, the woman flinched. Every time she moved, he would glance over, that smile widening slightly. And when we finally started our descent into San Francisco, He said one last thing so softly that I hardly heard it. See you around the neighborhood. We landed, and as soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, the woman grabbed her bag and hurried toward the front of the aircraft, while the man took his belongings. Gazed down at me. You ought to have kept your mouth shut, he remarked amicably. But I suppose it doesn't matter now, he said as he exited the aircraft, and I sat there for a while with my heart racing. After that, I grabbed my luggage and ran after the woman, trying to locate her in the terminal so I could make sure she reached a secure location. However, she had already left when I arrived at the gate area. Disappeared into the throng. Sometimes I think about her. Whether he was waiting outside her building with the blue door, if she moved again, whether she changed her number, whether she continued to run, or whether she made it home safely that night. At last he caught up to her, and I consider what he told me. I wonder what he meant, but it doesn't matter now. If aiding her had made me a target as well. Whether he is somehow aware of my name, address, and daily schedule. Because a few weeks ago, I noticed someone watching my building while standing in the dark shadows across the street from my unit. Their position reminded me of someone, even though I couldn't make out their face. Additionally, I discovered a message tucked under my door yesterday. Just 4 words written neatly. Keep your mouth shut. I'm not sure if it was him. I have no idea what his name is. However, I now find myself checking locks twice, peeking over my shoulder and changing up my routine. And each time I book a flight, I wonder whether I'll see him again. Sitting in a window seat with that icy smirk, just waiting to remind me that some people never forget. Most of us had whole rows to ourselves because the overnight flight from Los Angeles to Tokyo was just half full. I planned to sleep for most of the 13-hour journey, so I sprawled out over 3 seats in row 28. I had my eye mask, neck cushion, and noise-canceling headphones. Everything I required for a good night's sleep. However, I was awakened by something around 2 hours into the flight. It's more like a presence than a sound, the sensation you experience when you're being observed. I sat up after removing my eye mask. With the exception of a few reading lights and the lighting from the seatback screens, the cabin was dark. The majority of passengers were either asleep or engrossed in movies. However, there was a person standing in the aisle 3 seats ahead of me in 25-degree eyes. A teenage boy in a dark hoodie, about 16 or 17 years old. He was pointing his phone at me while holding it up. The light from the screen cast an unsettling blue glow over his face. I initially assumed he was either documenting the flight for social media or snapping a picture of the empty cabin. Children did that, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw that the phone was pointing straight at me. In particular, he was filming me. I looked at him, hoping he would realize I was awake and put down the phone, but he didn't. Simply continued to record, his face focused and expressionless. I whispered, "Hey," so as not to disturb other travelers. "What are you doing?" "So as not to disturb other travelers." "What are you doing?" He remained silent, didn't even recognize my words. The phone continued to ring. The camera was aimed at me. I experienced a surge of annoyance and discomfort. "Stop filming me, please." His gaze remained fixed on mine as he carefully dropped the phone. There was something strange about his gaze, even in the low light, too focused, too intense. Then silently, he turned and moved to the rear of the aircraft, vanishing into the restroom. Unsettled, I sat there for a while. Perhaps he was just an odd, socially uncomfortable child who didn't realize how unsettling it was to record a stranger. I thought about phoning a flight attendant, but what would I say? For 30 seconds, a teenager aimed a phone at me. It appeared to be an excessive response. I reclined, but I was unable to fall asleep at this time. That blank stare was on my mind all the time. The methodical and steady way he had gripped the phone. I gave up trying to sleep after about 20 minutes and got back up, taking out my own phone to see what time it was. I saw him again at that point. He was now seated at 23F, which was a few rows up and across the aisle from his previous location. His phone was back up and aimed at me. My stomach constricted. This wasn't at random. In order to obtain a better angle, he had purposely relocated. I got up and approached him, my annoyance taking precedence over caution. He put down the phone and gave me that same eerie look as I got closer. I firmly but softly said, "Why are you recording me?" "I'm not," he stated bluntly. There was something odd about his voice. No emotion, no inflection. "I've just seen you do it twice from separate seats." "You're not correct." He said it with such assurance that I briefly questioned what I had seen. Yet I was assured of what I had seen. I said, "Let me see your phone." He brought it nearer to his chest. "No." A flight attendant approached us after noticing us. Is everything okay?" While I was asleep, this child was recording me. I'm curious as to why. The child caught the attention of the flight attendant. "Is that correct, sir? Did you record this traveler?" In the same flat voice, he said, "No. All I was doing was using my phone. They're acting suspiciously. I noticed you." I persisted. "The phone was aimed straight at me. To gain a better view, you even rearranged the seats." He had moved from a vacant seat and the flight attendant looked at it. "Why did you switch seats?" "The armrest was broken," he blurted out. The flight attendant glanced between us, obviously unsure, and said, "I wasn't recording anyone." I hesitated before responding. "Sir, did you really see video being recorded on his screen? Or did you just see him holding his phone?" I hadn't seen the recording interface, but I had seen the screens illuminate, and the phone aimed at me. He was aiming it at me. "Other than that, why would he do that?" "Many reasons," the boy said. "I might have been texting. I might have been reading something. You thought I was filming you?" Practice diplomatically tempered the flight attendant's expression. "I recognize your worry, but there isn't much I can do in the absence of evidence of any misconduct." But she looked at the boy. "I'm going to ask you to go back to where you were sitting and to watch where you aim your phone. We desire everything. Passengers to be at ease." With a shrug, the boy got up and walked back to his seat in row 25 without protest. The flight attendant inquired as to whether I was happy with the outcome. I wasn't. What could I say, though? I didn't lie down again, but I nodded and went back to my row. I continued to watch him while sitting up. He was gazing at his phone and scrolling through something after settling into 25 degrees C. I was unable to see what was on his screen in the low light. Approximately 10 minutes went by. Then he got back up. This time he moved past my row and toward the back of the aircraft. He didn't look at me as he went by, but I could feel his bodily awareness of me. He entered the bathroom and shut the door. I held out. 5 minutes passed, followed by 10. The occupied sign remained illuminated. After 15 minutes, I began to fear that he might have become ill. Then the door opened, though, and he emerged. He walked carefully back up the aisle. This time, as he reached my row, he stopped, turned to face me, and grinned. It was a tiny, scarcely noticeable smile, but it felt so planned, as if he knew something I didn't, that it sent shivers down my spine. I saw him get comfortable as he went back to his seat. He raised his phone once more, this time pointing it in my way. I could see his face reflecting the light from the TV. That was all. I hit my call button, and when another flight attendant showed up, I reiterated the circumstances. The filming, the seat moving, the persistent behavior despite being ordered to cease. This flight attendant was very serious about it. I observed them having a lengthier talk after she went to talk to the boy. He showed her what he was scrolling through on his phone. She returned to me after nodding. I looked at his most recent pictures and vids. Quietly, she said, "Nothing about you can be found on his phone. The most current video is mainly airport footage taken prior to boarding." He agreed to keep his gadget lowered after I reminded him to be more mindful of where he points it, but I still saw him. "I get it. Furthermore, I'm not suggesting that what you witnessed is incorrect. We must take him at his word, nevertheless, in the absence of proof. I'll be keeping an eye on things. Press your call button right away if you notice him pointing his phone at you once more, and I'll deal with it more strongly." I was left feeling perplexed and furious as she left. Had I been mistaken? Was I being suspicious? However, I was aware of what I had witnessed. He had been filming me. I was positive of it. I made the decision to remain awake during the remainder of the flight. I took out my tablet and pretended to read, but in reality I was keeping a close eye on him. With his head against the window, he appeared to be dozing off. Hoodie arrived. However, his posture also seemed strange, as if he was pretending. Around 4 a.m. A few hours into the flight, Tokyo time, I got up to use the restroom. To get to the restroom, I had to walk by his row. I looked at him as I got closer. He had his eyes closed, was breathing steadily, and seemed to be asleep. I hurriedly went to the restroom before making my way back to my seat. I stopped when I saw something when I passed his row once more. With its screen facing up, his phone was recording while resting on the armrest. The camera app was open, and I could see the red timer counting in the corner of the screen. The camera on the phone was aimed at the aisle where I had just passed. He had been recording me using the restroom and returning, and now he was undoubtedly awake. His gaze was open, observing me while I gazed at his phone. His face lit up with the same tiny smile. I asked loudly enough to startle surrounding passengers, "What is your problem?" "I'm not recording you. I was recording myself for a video project. You just happened to walk by. You've been targeting me specifically since the flight started. Prove it." He responded calmly as he took up the phone and closed the app. The first flight attendant I spoke to hurried over and said, "What's going on?" "He's recording me. I just noticed it." His phone was recording when I walked past. The flight attendant turned to face the boy and asked, "Is your phone recording?" "No, see, they're harassing me now," he said, showing her the screen with the camera app closed. "I'm merely attempting to fall asleep." The flight attendant told me in a firm tone, "Sir, I need you to calm down and return to your seat. You're disturbing other passengers. He's the one who's been. Your seat now, or we'll need to take more action." I glanced around at the other passengers who were staring at me, then at the boy who was watching with that infuriating calm. I couldn't sit still, couldn't concentrate on anything, and kept looking up at his seat, watching for any movement. About 45 minutes later, he got up and walked past me again, heading to the bathroom. As he passed, he leaned down slightly and I heard him whisper something. Just 2 words, so quiet I nearly missed them. When he came back from the restroom, he had his phone out in the open, not trying to hide what he was doing, and he walked slowly. The camera pointed at me, recording, already uploaded. My blood went cold. Uploaded? Where? How? We were on a plane. There was no Wi on this flight. Unless some planes did have Wi-Fi, but it was expensive and had to be purchased. Had he bought it specifically to upload videos of me? We landed in Tokyo just after dawn, and as soon as the seatbelt sign turned off, I grabbed my bags and hurried off the plane, not wanting to be anywhere near him. But as I walked through Narita Airport, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was behind me. "Two can play this game," I said, my voice shaking with anger. He just smiled wider and continued walking, returning to his seat. I sat there with my phone still recording, aimed at his seat, my hands trembling. The remainder of the flight was a nightmare. I kept turning around and scanning the crowds. Once I thought I saw him, a figure in a dark hoodie about 50 feet back, but when I looked again, they were gone. At baggage claim, I pulled up Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok while I waited for my luggage, looking for any sign of videos of me sleeping on a plane or walking down an aisle. I found nothing. But that didn't mean they weren't out there, uploaded to some account I'd never find. That was 3 weeks ago. Uploaded to some account I'd never find. That was 3 weeks ago. I couldn't find any evidence of those videos, but I can't stop searching. I can't stop wondering what he meant by already uploaded. What website? What platform? Who has seen them? Worse, I can't stop thinking about that smile and the way he claimed to be filming himself for a video project. What if I wasn't the subject? What if I was merely in the background? What if there's a whole video out there and I'm just an unintentional extra? Last week, I received a notification on Instagram about a new follower who had no profile picture, no posts, no followers, and a username that was just a string of numbers. I blocked it right away, but then another person followed me and they never interacted, liked, or commented. They just watched. I'm not sure if it's him, whether those videos actually exist online, what he was actually recording or why, but occasionally late at night, I'll receive a notification that someone has viewed my profile. And I was supposed to fly standby on the 3 p.m. flight from Atlanta to Phoenix, but it was overbooked. The gate agent informed me that the next available seat was on the 9 p.m. red-eye. I wasn't happy about it, but I had no choice because I had to get home. By the time I boarded, I was exhausted. My assigned seat was 16A, a window seat near the wing. I wonder if he's still out there in his dark hoodie recording and watching. As I got closer, I noticed a middle-aged man in the aisle seat, 16C, reading something on his iPad. He barely looked up as I squeezed past him to the window. The middle seat, 16B, remained empty as the plane filled up, so I was a little relieved that at least I would have some room. However, right before the cabin door was closed, a woman, possibly in her 50s, hurried on board, breathing heavily as if she had been running, her eyes darting around, checking seat numbers. When she got to row 16, she stopped and stared at the man in the aisle. "You," she whispered as her face turned pale. The man slowly looked up from his iPad, but his expression remained unchanged. "Excuse me, what are you doing on this flight?" she said in a tight, barely controlled voice. "I'm traveling to Phoenix," she said. "Looks like we're neighbors," he said, gesturing to the empty middle seat. She did not sit down. "Ma'am, you need to take your seat." A flight attendant called from behind her, and the woman's eyes never left the man. She was standing in the aisle, holding her carry-on bag so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. Other passengers behind her were trying to get past, getting impatient. "Life is full of coincidences," he said calmly, turning back to his iPad. She finally sat down, moving as if every muscle in her body was fighting, and I saw that her hands were trembling as she buckled her seatbelt. The man read on, totally unfazed, but there was something deliberate about his stillness. Performed. The cabin lights dimmed as we took off, and the woman sat rigidly in her seat, staring straight ahead, barely breathing. I tried to concentrate on the book I had downloaded, but I couldn't help but notice the tension emanating from her. About 30 minutes into the flight, the man said, "How's your daughter?" The woman's entire body went rigid. She didn't answer. "Emma, right? She must be 12 already, right?" "Avoid mentioning her name." The woman's voice was hardly audible. "It's just conversation," he said mildly, making small talk with a seatmate. "That's normal, isn't it?" I felt very uncomfortable, trapped by the window with this increasingly unsettling interaction happening right next to me. The woman turned to face him, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. "You need to stay away from us. The restraining order expired," he smoothly interrupted. "I checked very carefully 3 weeks ago. I'm not breaking any laws by being on this plane or by sitting next to you. That's just..." And the woman punched her call button, and when the flight attendant arrived, she said, "I need to change seats." His use of the word "unfortunate coincidence" made it obvious that it was anything but. "I apologize, please. Tonight is fully booked. This dude is beyond your comprehension." She appeared to be at a loss for words as she glanced at him, and then back at the flight attendant. The flight attendant looked at the man, who grinned charmingly and said, "He's not supposed to be near me." "Am I prohibited from flying by a court order?" he inquired. The woman's face twisted. "Not anymore." At that point, I fear there is nothing I can do. With sympathy, the flight attendant said, "However, please notify me right away if either of you feels unsafe." The man returned to his iPad after she had left. With tears streaming down her face, the woman sat there sobbing in silence. I felt immobilized by the awkwardness and the developing sense that something was seriously wrong, even though I wanted to say something and take action. He responded, "You moved," following a while, keeping his eyes fixed on his screen. "I changed your phone number. Emma's school was even changed. Really detailed. Phoenix, however, is not that large. Emma continues to attend piano lessons every Tuesday at 4:00 p.m. You ought to give her a more varied routine. People are predictable because of their patterns." The woman let out a choking sound that was halfway between a gasp and a sob. He went on in the same gentle tone. "I'm not threatening you, just giving parent-to-parent amiable guidance. You get what I mean, though." At last he turned to face her. "I often reflect on that day and what transpired. Regarding David, do you?" "Quit," she muttered. "You certainly do. Something like that is something a mother never forgets. You had an extremely challenging trial. I was able to tell. All those inquiries, all that examination." He idly flipped through a page on his iPad. "However, it is now over. The legal aspect, anyhow. It's time to proceed. Perhaps begin a new chapter. I'm considering visiting Phoenix more frequently. Beautiful city. So many chances." I was unable to remain silent any longer. "It's obvious she doesn't want to speak with you." His eyes were icy when he turned to face me. "This is a private discussion between two individuals with the past. You have no idea who we are or what we've been through. She's afraid of you, I know that. Is she? Do you feel afraid?" "I'm not doing anything frightening," so he gave the woman an overly worried expression. "I'm simply sitting here discussing life on an aircraft that I paid for. She might be the issue if that scares her." The woman suddenly got to her feet. "I'm heading to the restroom." Squeezing by him, she vanished toward the rear of the aircraft. After observing her departure, the man returned his attention to his iPad. I took a seat. My heart was racing as I wondered what I had just seen. David was who? What had transpired throughout the trial? For about 20 minutes, the woman was absent. Her face was splotchy from sobbing when she returned, but she had partly collected herself. Without glancing at one of us, she took a seat. The man leaned a little in her direction. Even though it has been 3 years, Emma most likely still misses her younger brother. For a child, that is a long time. She probably still inquires about him occasionally. The woman's eyes began to well up with silent tears once more. The man went on quietly. I think about him every day, about how things might have been different, about second chances, about new beginnings with new families and new cities. My blood ran cold at the way he stated it. The woman's entire body was trembling at this point. I depressed my call button and waited for a flight attendant to arrive. "This man is harassing her," I firmly stated. "He must be moved or dealt with immediately." The head per was called over by the flight attendant. There was a brief, tense conversation. The man remained composed the entire time, claiming he had simply struck up a conversation and had done nothing wrong. However, they moved him to a seat close to the front of the aircraft, so they must have realized something was wrong. "Thank you," the woman whispered as she turned to face me after he had left. She was unable to complete the sentence. "But it doesn't matter. He knows where we live now. He found us and there's nothing legally stopping him from." "What happened?" I softly inquired. She shut her eyes. 3 years ago, my kid drowned. He was 9 years old. I know, but it was declared an accident." Her voice cracked. "He was being watched by that man. Both an inquiry and a trial were conducted, but no evidence was found. He was free to move." And now she began to cry once again. The woman hurried off the plane as soon as she could once we landed in Phoenix. In the terminal, I couldn't see her. However, as I strolled, I noticed him standing close to the exit in the direction of baggage claim, staring at his phone and simply waiting. I'm not sure if she noticed him. What transpired following that evening is unknown to me. However, I occasionally think about her, Emma, and the Tuesday piano lessons at 400 p.m. describes how people are predictable due to patterns. And I wonder whether he ever had that new beginning he mentioned. It was a normal trip from Minneapolis to Orlando until the man in 12F began to cry. He was staring at a manila envelope on his lap, while silent tears streamed down his face instead of loud, dramatic sobbing. About an hour into the journey, I observed him from across the aisle in 12D. Since boarding, he had been holding that packet tightly with both hands as if it may fly away. Tears were already trickling down the wrapped paper and his shoulders were trembling. A flight attendant came over. "Are you okay, sir? Is there anything I can get you?" He wiped his face with the back of his hand and shook his head without looking up. "I'm all right. I apologize." She paused, obviously worried, and then continued. She paused, obviously worried, and then continued. The man kept sobbing softly, and I experienced the awkward empathy you get for a stranger who is in pain. He might have lost someone. Perhaps he had received unfavorable news before to the journey. I gave him some privacy by turning back to my magazine. Then he opened the envelope, though. He could hardly rip the seal since his hands were trembling so much. When he eventually got it open, he pulled out what looked like photographs. From across the aisle, I couldn't see them well, but I could see his response. His expression changed from sadness to something very different. Horror, then anger, then shock. He crumpled one of the pictures in his fist and let out a sound that was almost like a growl. 12E, the woman sitting next to him, gave him a frightened look and moved away. He was now gasping as he gazed at the pictures that were still arranged on his tray table. Then he began to laugh, first softly and then loudly with a manic edge that caused a few other passengers to turn to watch. With the pictures still visible on the platter, he buried his head in his hands as the laughter turned back into tears. I ought not to have seen. I should have kept my mouth shut, but I could just make out one of the pictures from where I was. It displayed a lovely suburban house with a white fence and a red door. It was a typical picture of a typical house, with a woman standing in the driveway and conversing with someone whose back was to the camera. However, this man had been ruined by something. He took out his phone and gazed at it for a considerable amount of time. He seemed to be considering whether to make a call as his thumb lingered over the screen. After setting the phone aside, he collected the pictures and violently shoved them back into the package. With a start, the man sprang up and moved toward the rear of the aircraft. As I watched him go, I noticed how wobbly his gait was and how he supported himself against the seats. The woman in 12E hit her call button right away. "That man seems very upset," she said as a flight attendant came. "I'm a little concerned about him." "We're aware of the situation and monitoring it," the flight attendant muttered. About 10 minutes later, the man came back and said, "Thank you for letting us know." His eyes were puffy and red, but his face was damp, as if he had splashed water on it. As soon as he sat down, he took out the envelope once more and gazed at it as if it held the answers to unanswered questions. Then he took an odd action. He took out a pen and began writing on the envelope's exterior. Not merely a few words. He wrote all over the place, tiny, cramped text that took up all the space. After writing on the front, he turned it over and wrote on the back. He began writing on the pictures themselves when he ran out of space, flipping them over to scribble on the blank backs. Now obviously uncomfortable, the woman next to him was pressed up against the window. I didn't hold it against her. Something was present. He was writing in a frenetic and compulsive manner, as if he was attempting to record something before he forgot it or was interrupted. Once more, a flight attendant came over. "I must ask, sir, how are you feeling? Do you require any help?" His eyes were wild as he glanced up at her. "Do you know what it's like to have alignment throughout your entire life? Everything you believed to be true, everything you relied on has vanished," she said cautiously. "I'm sorry you're going through something difficult. When we arrive, is there someone we can call?" He gave a sour laugh. "Make a call. Who should I give a call to?" He trailed off, staring back down at the envelope, and that's who I would call. "It is irrelevant. We have resources if you're in a crisis." He said, "If you're worried about hurting myself, I won't. But there's something I need you to comprehend. Someone has to know." He displayed the envelope. "This arrived in my hotel room this morning. It was shoved under my door by someone. No note, no name. Just a flash disk and these pictures." The flight attendant looked from him to me and back again. "I'm not sure, sir." He cut me off. "My wife. These pictures show my wife with another man at our home. There are hundreds of them. Different times, different days. Videos, dates, and timestamps dating back 18 months are stored on the flash drive." His voice broke. "I'm returning home from a business trip on this airplane. Someone asked me what happens when I'm away, and I've been away for 4 days. The flight attendant's face softened. "I apologize deeply. That must hurt so much." He pointed to the text-covered envelope and continued, "But right now I need to make sure I'm writing down everything. All the information I can recall. Every time I trusted her, every business trip, and every lie she must have spoken." Because he paused and clenched his jaw when I got home. "When I come home, I have no idea what I'll do." I shuddered at the way he stated it. The flight attendant's countenance changed, so she must have sensed it too. He said, "I think it would be best if you took some time to calm down before I am calm." And that was the most terrifying aspect. He spoke in a cool, collected tone that was absolutely level. Never in my life have I felt more at ease. I can see well for the first time. I understand exactly what must take place. The flight attendant moved to the front of the cabin after excusing herself. She was talking urgently to 2 other crew members, and I noticed that they were all looking back toward row 12. One of them answered the cockpit phone. The man resumed writing on the envelope, periodically taking out his phone to check things before continuing. He once sent someone a picture of the envelope, which was now entirely covered in his handwriting. "I need proof of my mental state," he whispered to himself. "Do you require documentation?" The flight attendant came back with what I thought was the head purser. They had a quiet conversation with him, and I heard bits and pieces, "Worried for your well-being. Authorities on the ground, resources available." He nodded throughout, consenting to their requests, yet his hands continued to move, adding more text to the envelope's already packed slots. We started to descend toward Orlando. The man cradled the envelope against his chest after gently placing everything back inside. 2 airport security guards were waiting at the jet bridge, as I could see through the window as we taxied to the gate. Everyone was asked to stay seated by the flight attendants. After boarding, the officers had a brief conversation with the man. He was helpful, giving them the envelope and explaining something that I couldn't hear. A few minutes later, they permit him to gather his possessions. He was not being taken into custody. He was only being escorted away, most likely for a wellness examination. He stopped when he passed my row and gave me a direct look. "Did you not see the pictures? You were searching." I was at a loss for words. "Remember them," he urged. "Recall what you've seen. I may need someone who can verify their existence after tonight." The officers escorted him as he continued to walk. My thoughts were racing as I sat there. What was he trying to say? Did he have any plans? The images only depicted a woman and a house. They were neither violent nor damning. However, it was clear from his response, his remarks, and the meticulous recording that he was getting ready for something. It was 2 months ago. Since then, I've been thinking about that flight nonstop and wondering what transpired when he returned home that evening. I've looked through the local Orlando news for any stories about a husband returning from a business trip, a suburban home with a red door, or an unsuccessful altercation. Nothing was found by me. No reports, no news articles, nothing. However, there are moments when I wonder if that's because nothing happened, or if whatever did happen was discreet and cautious enough to go unreported, and I consider that envelope with his handwriting on it that was given to security guards, who most likely filed it away without actually reading it. Proof of something. A mindset, a strategy, or a caution that was ignored in time. I was sitting in 24B on a late afternoon trip from Detroit to Las Vegas, sandwiched between an old woman knitting by the window and a businessman who dozed off before takeoff. Before the man in front of me dropped something, the trip appeared to be nothing special. It touched down near my feet. A folded piece of paper had fallen between his seat and the wall. With the intention of tapping his shoulder and giving it back, I picked it up. However, something stopped me when I unfolded it. The list was meticulously scrawled in block letters. Gate C14, 3:47 p.m. Verify the 4th target boarding group. Place yourself next to family seat 23. In flight, the C window side is accessible. Await the beverage service. Approaching the bathroom in 2 hours and 15 minutes when there is turbulence. Phoenix comes after the luggage. Azel begins with a silver Honda Civic plate. Keep to the timeline. As I read it again, my gut nodded. Target comes after the luggage. This was not a trip itinerary or to-do list. This was a strategy. And right now we were flying somewhere between Las Vegas and Detroit, except that Phoenix was listed on the list. I examined the seat. Except that Phoenix was listed on the list. I examined the seat.